All right, so step one, which I did not cover on Monday, is just to get the cone on the hook. We had a couple people put it on backwards on Monday. So small hole. All right, I got it lined up. Small hole over the point, and with a lot of these hooks, you're going to get about, well, actually, that one went on nice and easy. Sometimes there's a little bit of resistance going on, and you just got to shove it over the top of it. But the skinny end of the cone goes onto the point so that it ends up, you know, at the eye of the hook. And then once you get that on there, you can secure it in the vise. If you choose to, this is a good time to smash the barb if you want to. And next step is, I always do this before I start tying it, is when you take your Zonker strip, you'll notice all the hair goes in one direction. And if you follow that direction down to the end, you're going to notice that all this leather is cut square. We want to taper that. We're going to cut a taper into this leather here.
Just pass that around.
And I'll show you how I do that. Get my scissors here. I'm just going to take this and
A little closer to the eye. There you go.
and it doesn't have to be perfect, but basically I'm just going to cut a little taper into that. It's not perfect, but I don't really care, because the whole point behind cutting a taper into that is that because there's less mass at the tip, at the very end of this tail, the water is going to have more effect on it. It's going to move more. And you'll see on the last one, we're using 2 Zonkers because we're using 2 hooks. The front hook, we're not going to taper it because we don't want a ton of movement on it. But the back one, we're going to do this exact same thing. So once you get that taper in, we're going to set that down and we can start our thread.
You want to tell them about why we're using 6.0 and what the other numbers are?
Yeah, sure. So we're using 6.0 today, which 6/0, they make 8/0, 10/0, 12/0. The higher the number, the thinner the thread, which means the less bulk. A fly this small, if you use 3/0 or, you know, like a 140 denier or a 210, those are really thick. You're going to build up a lot of bulk really fast. And we're trying to minimize that, especially with whip finishing. It's more important with smaller dry flies, and you'll see that when we do some dry flies, that counting your thread wraps so that you're not building unnecessary bulk really comes in handy. And this is, they don't,
6.0.
yeah, but they don't, I was wondering how many denier it is, but they don't tell you.
They don't, but 6.0 is probably about...
Griffin says it's 136.
136?
Yeah.
This is at 136.
Okay. Yeah, Uni, and there's all sorts of different threads out there. There's Uni, which is round. There's UTC, which is flat. Really doesn't make a big difference in what we're doing. But I would encourage you, if you're at home and you're using a thread you've never used before, because thread tension in fly tying is such a big thing to understand, is when you start your thread, pull on it till it breaks. And then you know how hard you can pull on that thread and how much tension you can tie with. Because if you watch the screen when I'm tying this, you're going to see my hook deflecting because of how much tension I'm using, because I don't want stuff to roll around when I'm done. And I'm going to I'll explain how I'm going to tie this in when I do it, because each wrap there's more tension and more tension and more tension, and that's going to lock this in so that it's not going to roll on me. Foam is a really hard material to tie with because it wants to roll on you, and tension with foam is a big, and glue helps with that too. But so let's get our thread started. Does everybody know how to start your thread? Have you guys? Okay, So you're going to take some thread out of the end of your bobbin, and how I was taught is hold your bobbin up high, thread down low, and you're just going to push that thread against the hook. And then you're going to wrap over and away. And you're going to wrap a couple times while holding tension, and then start wrapping backwards over this tag end. And what that's going to do is it's eventually going to lock it in there, so you don't need to hold on to it anymore. You're basically, it's almost like tying a nail knot on your hook.
This is set up pre-left or right? Right.
So once you get that thread started, you can cut it, you can break it. 6/0 is pretty easy to break. Once you get up higher, you'll start cutting your fingers trying to do it. We're just going to move our thread back to the end of the shank, the straight part, which inevitably is about right in between the point and the barb. I'm going to wait for these guys to catch up. It's always fun using somebody else's equipment, because you never know what's going to happen. Forgot my water.
Blind time is something that you never time before.
Yeah.
I.e. barely juice. First one always looks fun.
All right. So we pre-cut these at 2 inches, and for these, oh, okay. I thought you were going already. Sorry.
No, we're just getting started. And don't worry, we'll come around and get you caught up, unwind. I'm just winding back.
The light makes a big difference.
Did you not use them last time?
No, it was a little dark.
I wonder why.
Well, not so much for the time, but for the video.
Yeah.
So now they will see it wind over it, away from
Well, you can almost time the dark, but
And he wound it back to this part, which is called the bend, right where it starts to slope down.
Yep. So you can see right now, my thread is just hanging in between that barb and that point. And that's a good spot to start tying in any tail material. So we're going to take this zonker, and that tapered portion that we cut in there is going to be all the way at the end of that tail.
You need more thread,
So how do we figure out how long we want the tail? For this, I prefer
you'll go fast.
1 shank length, not including the taper. So I'm going to take this taper and I'm going to hide it in my fingers. And I'm going to hold right here up to the eye of the hook, and that's going to tell me where I want to tie this in. Now I'm going to transfer hands, and I'm actually going to take all this hair, and it helps if you wet your fingers. Well, here is the flight. And watch what happens when I wet this. This stuff is so much easier to work with if you wet it, because I can part that hair. Because I don't want to tie any hair down when I'm tying in just the tail. And you'll see at the very end when we tie it down for good, we do want to tie down hair. So I'm going to part that hair right where I want to tie it in. And I'm going to take this zonker in my left hand, and I'm going to place that part right over where my thread's hanging. And I'm going to pinch that down to that hook via my left hand.
See how I separate the hair?
And here's the important part, the tension. So my first wrap is going to be pretty loose. My second wrap is going to be a little bit tighter. And then you can see if I pull on this, my zonker wants to roll on me. So I'm going to get that back to the top of the shank. Third wrap, even tighter. Fourth wrap, even tighter. And then to lock all this in, because if I let go right now, all that tension's lost and your stuff's going to move. So I'm going to pull this leather back. I'm going to wrap up the hook, and then back down the hook, right back to where that zonker is tied in. I'm not going to tie on top of the zonker anymore. I'm just going to basically lock in all that tension by wrapping forward and back. So at this point, I like to, normally I tie with very little thread out of the end of my bobbin, so I get good control and thread placement. At this point, I'm going to pull it right down to the table so I have some thread exposed, because now we're going to start our dubbing noodle, the body. And just like dry flies, less is more. We want a nice tight noodle, and what we're going to end up doing is we're going to wrap our dubbing noodle up and then back down about 3/4 of the way and then back up, and that's going to build that conical taper that most flies have. And so this should be enough for me to do one fly. Because it's so bulky, we end up using a lot of dubbing, and we have more if you guys run out. But the key here, so out of this big clump, I'm going to start with that much, very little. And to get this on, I'm going to place it in my right hand, and I'm just going to rest it up against the thread, and I'm going to pretend I have glue on my fingers, and I'm going to pinch and rub, and then pinch and rub all in the same direction. If you go back and forth, it's not going to do anything. So if you keep going in the same direction like you're trying to rub glue off your finger, and it should,
That part you can adjust later.
see if I can get this on the camera, yeah, it should end up,
With the leather flat on top.
you know, just like a little rope or noodle of dubbing. There's,
Try, they're still getting their strips on there.
Okay.
So it's-
hold up a sec, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you might add a little more dubbing there just so they
Yeah.
see.
And I tend to, you know, fill this whole strip up so I don't have to add as
Real
much
close to it in front.
each time.
Good. Many turns. Wind it all the
But
way
this
up.
also, as you advance your skills in fly tying, there's options for dubbing
And then all the way back to the-
or applying your dubbing. Frequently I will use a dubbing loop to do this. You do get more durability.
Frequently you what?
I use a dubbing loop.
Oh,
A lot of people struggle with dubbing loops. I did for the longest time.
Have you got 6 over
But
you using?
when I finally figured it out and got a good tool for it,
Well, just
and figured out that it was all about tension, I love loops. I do dubbing loops in almost
Good. Now
every
you're ready
fly.
for your dubbing.
Um,
So, here,
It's
and this is what I was.
so if you guys want to start,
we're gonna-
we're just gonna again touching turns.
You got it, good.
Each
You
turn,
don't wanna make it.
that rope's gonna touch the last one, and we're just gonna advance
Thin it out a little bit.
up the hook.
But pitch real hard in the same direction all the
And if it starts getting loose, just pinch and turn.
time. Yeah, like you have rubber cement on here. Okay, good.
And so I ran out pretty quick.
So you wanna run
I'm
it
just
up?
gonna add more.
Keep the tension on it, keep it out of your way.
just go back.
Hold your
Yep.
bobbin, not your thread.
So once, and here I'll show you. And we're gonna dub over the dubbing we just put on there.
You did.
You don't have to advance your thread backwards. So I'm gonna get
But we're gonna take it.
another noodle here and I'll show you. I'm going to tie all the way up to that bead or the cone, and then I'm going to start dubbing backwards.
And then just touch it on the thread.
You know, just
And then you're
doing the same technique all the way back down, or 3/4 of the way back down.
What I want you to do is take that, and then I want you to,
This on here. You can use wax with certain dubbings because it doesn't want to stick very well. So as you wrap down,
start back there.
a
Okay,
couple of
so,
wraps out of this.
Go ahead and pinch that on there. Can we take it, wet your finger a little bit, something. You can use hand sanitizer.
And so I'm going about 3/4 of the way back down to the body. And I gotta save a little bit for the
Pinch in one
after the
direction.
collar.
The best example is as if you had rubber cement. Good, that's really good. Just add a little more than that.
And if you add more, too much dubbing, too thick, it's almost just, it's not going to stick very well. So that's why doing thin noodles and just more
See
passes.
how thick he's got it on up there? That's good.
That.
Now, go back there.
So I'm going to
just underneath there.
advance again, straight forward,
Wind it nice and close to it.
all the way up to that bead. And then we're going to stop there for a second. This, when I'm tying a lot of flies, I'll basically get the tail put on, I'll half hitch it, I'll set it down, I'll do the next one. So right now, if I was at home, I would put a half hitch here, so that in my next step, if I screwed up or my thread broke, I saved it, because that will happen. You don't have to, but I found it's saved me a few times. And you'll notice, even though we tied right up to this cone, there's still a lot of room here. You know, it wants to move. This, we purposely cut these zonkers long, and that's because we want that excess to keep this cone from moving. And when we tied this in, we didn't tie over any hair, so it lays nice and flat. Here, I'm going to pull this zonker strip forward nice and tight, and I'm going to pinch this hair down, and I'm going to tie over it. And watch what happens. And we're going to do the same tension, same four wraps, light tension, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And when I let go of this, see how that hair stands up? Right here. It gives it a shoulder because we're tying down on that hair. It kicks it up. And that helps give this fly some profile as opposed to just being flat. So at this point, I've got it tied in. And I do need to cut a little bit of this off. I don't want to cut it all off, all this tag. I'm going to cut about half of it. I'm going to cut half. And then I'm going to take this, my point of my scissors, and I'm going to push this cone up. I'm going to tuck that into that cone. And then I'm going to tie over it. I'm just going to fill in and keep that from going anywhere. But that, now you'll see this cone doesn't really move that much. We're going to put some more material there to really lock it in and fill in that gap around it, because it's a pretty big cone.
Yeah.
And if it's a little short, you can fill it with more dubbing.
Yeah, but it enough.
You know,
A
and
little more.
yeah, when in doubt, more dubbing, just to fill up that front little spot. But now, before the dubbing, we're gonna tie a collar in, and this collar just adds a little bit more movement. This is a great place to add a different color. You could do a red collar, you could do an olive collar, you could do pink. I mean, the sky's the limit, which is kind of nice. You can get really creative with these. I like doing, if I do these in white, I'll do a red collar. Kind of looks like a little rainbow trout or something. But to tie that in,
You get it okay, Rick?
Yeah.
up on the right side of the feather here. On these schlappen feathers, you'll see that one side has kind of an iridescence to it. That's not showing up very well on here. One side's shiny
Wind back a little bit.
and concave, the other side is convex, and it doesn't really have any kind of green.
Twist on it.
So as we tie this in, we want that concave side going back. It's just going to help these feathers lay right. And we're going to tie it in by the tip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it by the tip. I'm going to preen all these feathers down. And I like when these collars go back a little ways, like that far. So I try to get my collar to go at half, almost half of the way back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find where these fibers start going that far back on this fly, which is right there.
You see what he's saying, Zach? Because the length of the barbules get longer and you get further.
And I'm going to hold these down out of the way, and I'm going to cut this. I'm going to cut that tip, and I'm going to create a little triangle tie-in point. It's easier to cut it off the fly than it is on the fly. That's how I end up cutting my thread a lot, is by doing it after I tie it in. So just like the Zonker, I'm going to lay this. I'm going to lay it on the side facing me so I can see it. And I'm just going to do a nice light wrap to capture it. And then probably 3 or 4 wraps just to lock it in. And I'm going to let my bobbin sit here. And there's a couple different ways to get your feathers to do what you want it to. Because we're putting dubbing in front, you can just wait. I like to push these backwards the direction I want them to go. And if you roll them in between your fingers like you got glue on them, it'll help them stay back. Certain feathers, you have to do this. Like I love doing this with marabou. Marabou collars are great, but they're a pain to work with. So I'm going to grab this feather in my right hand. I'm going to pull these fibers back. And with light tension, because you can break these stems very easily, I'm going to do 1, 2, I'm going to take a look at it. I like 2 wraps. 2 wraps on this with this feather looks pretty good. So to tie this off, I'm going to take my thread, go up and behind this feather. And never let go of the feather unless you're holding tension on your thread. So once I get 2 wraps around this, I'm going to switch hands. I went from holding it with my right to holding it with my left. Holding pressure on my bobbin, I can let go. Pull it all back, do a couple securing wraps, just like we did with the Zonker, wrap forward, wrap back.
One of the things to look at too is you notice how all feathers have a concave side and a convex.
And now the way not to cut off what you just tied on is you want to open your scissors just enough to get the stem through there. Did that show up? See how very little that scissor is open? I'm going to pull this fiber a little bit forward out of the way. I'm going to get that V in there and snip it off. And then that way you're not cutting a bunch of fibers out of the way.
I would hold it this way so that the convex on the back.
And if all your fibers are facing forward, don't worry about it. Because we're going to preen them back and we're going to put dubbing in front of it to keep them back. And so once you get your feather tied in, you're going to take a little bit of dubbing.
No, not at all. You just want it to be tight.
And do the same noodle. And it can be a little loose, it doesn't have to be super tight. I'm going to slide it up and then I'm going to hold these fibers out of the way. Do a little bit of wrapping here, it got a little crazy on me. And I need a little bit more. It's the nice thing about fly tying is if you don't like it, unwrap and do it again. Get it to where you like it.
So we want each turn just barely in front of the last. So we wind.
So again, I'm just going to put a little bit more dubbing here.
And your second one.
Right behind the bead.
Leather on the
And once you get that in there, you can whip finish or half hitch. Whatever you feel comfortable doing. If you, you've got the Hare'e.
Start right at where
because this thread is hidden behind this cone, you don't necessarily need head
So you
cement.
don't tie them all down.
If you choose to, that's cool.
And then wind it right up to
I
the cone,
personally,
tie it
I
off.
don't think I ever use head cement.
And I'll show you how we tie it
Just
off.
a
I'll take one more wrap.
Personal thing.
Good.
I have a vendetta against.
And by the way, when you
That's
wind
me.
those over, you want to hold straight.
But that's it. Again, very
If you
simple.
go like this, they twist.
I don't have it today because it's in my
So now, this is the way we tie
That's in my
every
car,
knot
but my
on a fly.
small streamer box is 75% Zonkers.
Unravel.
All different colors, all have a tungsten head. I tie them a little different for myself. I tie them on tubes. I don't tie them on hooks. I really like tube flies. I like how they move.
One more.
But it's the same body. It's the same Zonker strip, and it has a collar. It's
I think you got it. So
exactly
now,
the same.
Because they're tubular.
you can nip
Tubular
that
tubes, man.
The neater you
But
trim,
it's
the
a-
better the fly. And then you
I've
can
caught a
take the
lot of
thread,
nice
pull
fish
back,
on
and just take
Zonkers,
the
even
turn.
smaller than this.
No, he's lucky. He doesn't catch
Are you
fish.
getting it, everyone?
I think I've got a picture of a 19 with a Zonker in its mouth from the Boardman. So I mean, but yeah, you can fish them anywhere. Bass will eat these. It's a really effective pattern that if you can get the pattern down, and you know, some people are really good at tying pretty flies, but they don't necessarily catch fish.
Or at the cone. You're winding it up toward the cone, keep the pressure
But
on.
that's a very,
Smooth.
Fishy fly.
yeah.
Good, maybe one more. That's
And they're easy, they're quick.
in the
I
right
mean,
point. Bring it
and
up.
if you prep all this at home, like I